Chapter 7 Pagan Custom and Barbarian Genius Infused into Christianity. The Western intellect, in order to accept the gospel, had to sublimate it into a Neoplatonic system of metaphysics. In like manner, the Western heart had to render Christianity congenial and adequate by a rich infusion of pagan custom and sentiment. This adaptation was more gentle and facile than might be supposed. We are too much inclined to impute and abstract an ideal Christianity to the polyglot souls of early Christians, and to ignore that mysterious and miraculous side of antique religions from which Christian cultus and ritual are chiefly derived. In the 3rd century, Christianity and devout paganism were, in a religious sense, closely akin. Each differed much less from the other than from that religion which at other epochs have borne or should bear its own name. Had Julian the Apostate succeeded in his enterprise, he would not have rescued anything which the admirers of classic paganism could at all rejoice in. A disciple of Iamblichus could not but plunge headlong into the same sea of superstition and dialect which had submerged Christianity. In both parties, ethics were irrational and morals corrupt. The political and humane religion of Hellenism had disappeared, and the question between Christians and pagans amounted simply to a choice of fanaticisms. Reason had suffered a general eclipse, but civilization, although decayed, still subsisted, and a certain scholastic discipline, a certain speculative habit, and many an ancient religious usage remained in the world. The people could change their gods, but not the spirit in which they worshipped them. Christianity had insinuated itself almost unobserved into a society full of rooted traditions. The first disciples had been disinherited Jews, with religious habits which men of other races and interests could never have adopted intelligently. The Church was accordingly wise enough to perpetuate in its practice at least an indispensable minimum of popular paganism. How considerable this minimum was at a glance at Catholic piety will suffice to convince us. The Greco-Jewish system of theology, constructed by the Fathers, had its liturgical counterpart in the sacraments and in a devout eloquence which may be represented to us fairly enough by the Roman Missal and Breviary. This liturgy, transfused as it is with pagan philosophy and removed thereby from the oriental directness and formlessness of the Bible, keeps for the most part its theological and patristic tone. Psalms abound, Virgin and saints are barely mentioned. A certain universalism and concentration of thought upon the redemption and its speculative meaning pervades the Latin ritual sung behind the altar rails. But any one who enters the Catholic Church with an intelligent interpreter will at once perceive the immense distance which separates that official and impersonal ritual from the daily prayers and practices of Catholic people. The latter refer to the real exigencies of daily life and serve to express and reorganize personal passions. While the Mass is being celebrated, the old woman will tell her beads, lost in a vague rumination over her own troubles. While the priests chant something unintelligible about Abraham or Nebuchadnezzar, the housewife will light her wax candles, duly blessed for the occasion, before St. Barbara, to be protected thereby from the lightning. And while the preacher is repeating, by rote, dialectical subtleties about the union of the two natures in Christ's person, a listener's fancy may float sadly over the mystery of love and life, and being himself without resources and premises, he may order a Mass to be said for the repose of some departed soul. In a Catholic country, every spot and every man has a particular patron. These patrons are sometimes local worthies, canonized by tradition or by the Roman See, but no less often are they simply local appellations of Christ or the Virgin. Appellations which are known theoretically to refer all to the same numen, but which practically possess diverse religious values. For the miracles and intercessions attributed to the Virgin under one title are far from being miracles and intercessions attributable to her under another. He who has been all his life devout to Loreto will not place any special reliance on the pillar at Saragossa. A bereaved mother will not fly to the Immaculate Conception for comfort, but of course to Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows. Each religious order, and all the laity, more or less affiliated to it, will cultivate special saints and special mysteries. There are also particular places and days on which graces are granted, as not on others, and the quantity of such graces is measurable by canonic standards. So many days of the remitted penance correspond to a work of a certain merit, for there is a celestial currency in which milks and remissions may be accurately summed and subtracted by angelic recorders. One man's spiritual earnings may by gift be attributed and imputed to another, a belief which may seem arbitrary and superstitious, but which is really a natural corollary to fundamental doctrines like the atonement, the communion of saints, and intercession for the dead and living. Another phase of the same natural religion is seen in frequent festivals, in the consecration of buildings, ships, fields, labors, and seasons, in intercessions by the greater dead for the living, and by the living for the lesser dead. A perfect survival of heroes and penance on the one hand, and of pagan funeral rites and commemorations on the other. Add Lent with its carnival, Ember Days, All Saints, and All Souls, Christmas with its Magi, or its St. Nicholas, St. Agnes, and St. Valentine's Days, with their profane associations, and another for prospering amorettes. Since all great and tragic loves have their inevitable patrons in Christ and the Virgin, in Mary Magdalene, and in the mystics innumerable, this, with what more could easily be rehearsed, makes a complete paganism within Christian tradition. A paganism little basis can be found in the Gospel, the Mass, the Breviary, or the theologians. Yet these accretions were as well authenticated as the substructure, for they rested on human nature. To feel, for instance, the special efficacy of your village virgin, or of the miraculous Christ, whose hermitage is perched on the overhanging hill, is a genuine experience. The principle of it is clear and simple. Those shrines, those images, the festivals associated with them, have entered your mind together with your earliest feelings. Your first glimpses of mortal vicissitudes have coincided with the awe and glitter of sacramental moments in which those noumena were invoked. And on that deeper level of experience, in those lower reaches of your rationalism in which such impressions lie, they constitute a mystic resource, subsisting beneath all conventions and overt knowledge. When the doctors blunder, as they commonly do, the saints may find a cure. After all, the saint's success in medicine seems to a crude empiricism almost as probable as the physician's. Special and local patrons are the original gods, and whatever religious speculative and cosmic deities they retain surreptitiously, by virtue of those very bonds with human interests and passionate desires which ancestral demons once borrowed from the hearth they guarded, the mountain they haunted, or the sacrifice they inhaled with pleasure, until their hearts softened toward their worshippers. In itself, and as a minimized and retreating theology represents it, a universal power has no specific energy, no determinate interest at heart, There is nothing friendly about it, nor allied to your private necessities. No links of place and time fortify and define its influence, nor is it rational to appeal for a mitigation of evils, or for assistance against them, to the very being that has decreed and is inflicting them for some fixed purpose of its own. Paganism, or natural religion, was at first, like so many crude religious notions, optimistic and material. The worshipper expected his piety to make his pot boil, to cure his disease, to prosper his battles, and to render harmless his ignorance of the world in which he lived. But such faith ran up immediately against the facts. It was discountenanced at every turn by experience and reflection. The whole of nature and life, when they are understood at all, have to be understood on an opposite principle, on the principle that fate, having naturally furnished us with a determinate will and a determinate endowment, gives us a free field and no favor in the natural world. Hence the retreat of religion to the supernatural, a region to which in its cruder forms it was far from belonging. Now this retreat, in the case of classic paganism, took place with the decay of military and political life, and would have produced an ascetic popular system, some compound of Oriental and Greek traditions, even if Christianity had not intervened at that juncture and opportunely preempted the ground. Christianity, as we have seen, had elements in it which gave it a decisive advantage. Its outlook was historical, not cosmic, and consequently admitted a non-natural future for the individual and for the church. It was anti-political and looked for progress only in that region in which progress was at that time possible, in the private soul. It was democratic, feminine, and unworldly. Its oriental deity and prophets had a primitive simplicity and pathos not found in pagan heroes or polite metaphysical entities. Its obscure Hebrew poetry opened, like music, an infinite field for brooding fancy and presumptions. The consequence was a doubling of the world, so that every Christian led a dual existence, one full of trouble and vanity on earth, which it was piety in him to despise and neglect, another full of hope and consolation in a region parallel to earth and directly above it, every part of which corresponded to something in earthly life and could be reached, so to speak, by Jacob's ladder, upon which aspiration and grace ascended and descended continually. Birth had sacramental consecration to the supernatural in baptism, growth in confirmation, self-consciousness in confession, puberty in communion, effort in prayer, defeat in sacrifice, sin in penance, speculation in revealed wisdom, art in worship, natural kindness in charity, poverty in humility, death in self-surrender and resurrection. When the mind grew tired of contemplation, the lips would still echo some pious petition, keeping the body's attitude and habit expressive of humility and propitious to receiving grace. And when the knees and lips were themselves weary, a candle might be left burning before the altar to witness that the desire momentarily forgotten was not extinguished in the heart. Through prayer and religious works, the absent could be reached and the dead helped on the journey, and amid earthly estrangements and injustices, there always remained the Church, open to all, in the society of heaven. Nothing is accordingly more patent than that Christianity was paganized by the early Church. Indeed, the creation of the Church was itself what, to a Hebraizing mind, might seem a corruption, namely, a mixing of pagan philosophy and ritual with the gospel. But this sort of constitutive corruption would more properly be called an adaptation, an absorption, or even a civilization of Hebraism. For by this marriage with paganism, Christianity fitted itself to live and work in the civilized world. By this corruption, it was completed and immensely improved, like Anglo-Saxon, by its corruption through French and Latin. For it is always an improvement in religion, whose business it is to inspire a spiritual sentiment, that it should learn to express and inspire that sentiment more generously. Paganism was nearer than Hebraism to the life of reason, because its myths were more transparent and its temper less fanatical. And so paganized Christianity approached more closely that ideality which constitutes religious truth than a bare and intense Hebraism in its hostility to human genius could ever have done if isolated and unqualified. The Christianity which the pagans adopted, in becoming itself pagan, remained a religion natural to their country and their heart. It constituted a paganism expressive of their latter and calamitous experience, a paganism acquainted with sorrow, a religion that had passed through both civilization and despair, and had been reduced to translating the eclipsed values of life into supernatural symbols. It became a post-rational religion. Of course, to understand such a system, it is necessary to possess the faculties it exercises and the experience it represents. Where life has not reached the level of reflection, religion and philosophy must both be pre-rational. They must remain crudely experimental, unconscious of the limits of excellence and life. Under such circumstances, it is obviously impossible that religion should be reconstituted on a supernatural plane, or should learn to express experience rather than impulse. Now the Christianity of the Gospels was itself post-rational. It had turned its back on the world. In this respect, the mixture with paganism altered nothing. It merely reinforced the spiritualized and lyric despair of the Hebrews with the personal and metaphysical despair of the Romans and Greeks. For all the later classic philosophy, Stoic, Skeptic, or Epicurean, was founded on despair and was post-rational. Pagan Christianity, or Catholicism, may accordingly be said to consist of two elements. First, the genius of paganism, the faculty of expressing spiritual experience in myth and external symbol, and second, the experience of disillusion, forcing that pagan imagination to take wing from earth and to decorate no longer the political and material circumstances of life, but rather to remove beyond the clouds and constitute its realm of spirit beyond the veil of time and nature, in posthumous and metaphysical sphere. A mythical economy, abounding in points of attachment to human experience and in genial interpretations of life, yet lifted beyond visible nature and filling a reported world, a world believed in on hearsay, or, as it is called, on faith. That is Catholicism. When this religion was established in the Roman Empire, that empire was itself threatened by the barbarians, who soon permeated and occupied it, and made a new and unhappy beginning to European history. They adopted Christianity, not because it represented their religious needs or inspiration, but because it formed part of a culture and a social organization, the influence of which they had not, in this simplicity, the means to withstand. During several ages, they could only modify by their misunderstandings and inertia arts wholly new to their lives. What sort of religion these barbarians may previously have had is beyond our accurate knowledge. They handed down a mythology not radically different from the Greco-Roman, though more vaguely and grotesquely conceived, and they recognized tribal duties and glories from which religious sanctions could hardly have been absent. But a barbarian mind, like a child's, is easy to convert, and to people with what stories you will. The Northmen drank in, with pleased astonishment, what the monks told them about heaven and hell, God the Father, and God the Son, the Virgin, and the beautiful angels. They accepted the sacraments with vague docility. They showed a qualified respect, often broken upon, it is true, by instinctive rebellions, for a clergy which, after all, represented whatever vestiges of learning, benevolence, or art still lingered in the world. But this easy and boasted conversion was fanciful only, and skin deep, a non-Christian ethics of valor and honor, a non-Christian fund of superstition, legend, and sentiment subsisted always among medieval peoples. Their soul, so largely inarticulate, might be overlaid with churchy habits and imprisoned for the moment in the panoply of patristic dogma. But pagan Christianity always remained a religion foreign to them, accepted only while their minds continued in a state of helpless tutelage. It was thus that the Roman Church hatched the duck's egg of Protestantism. In its native seats, the Catholic system prompts among those who inwardly reject it satire and indifference rather than heresy, because on the whole it expresses well enough the religious instincts of the people. Only those strenuously oppose it who hate religion itself. But among converted barbarians, the case was naturally different, and opposition to the Church came most vehemently from certain religious natures, whose instincts it outraged or left unsatisfied. Even before heresy burst forth, this religious restlessness found vent in many directions. It endowed Christianity with several beautiful but insidious gifts, several incongruous though well-meant forms of expression. Among these we may count Gothic art, chivalrous sentiment, and even scholastic philosophy. These things came, as we know, ostensibly to serve Christianity, which has learned to regard them as its own emanations. But in truth, they barbarized Christianity, just as Greek philosophy and worship and Roman habits of administration had paganized it in the beginning, and barbarized Christianity, even before it became heretical, was something new, something very different in temper and beauty from the pagan Christianity of the South and East. In the Catholicism of the Middle Ages, as it flourished in the North, the barbarian soul, apprenticed to monkish masters, appeared in all its childlike trust, originality, and humor. The tragic meaning of the Christian faith, its immense renunciation of all things earthly, and the merely metaphysical glory of its transfigured life, commonly escaped apprehension, as it still continues to do. People listened, open-mouthed, to the missionary, and accepted his observations with unsuspecting emotion. A seed planted in such a virgin and uncultivated soil must needs bring forth fruit of a new savor. In Northern Christianity, a fresh quality of brooding tenderness prevailed over the tragic passion elsewhere characteristic of Catholic devotion. Intricacy was substituted for dignity, and poetry for rhetoric. The basilica became an abbey, and the hermitage a school. The feudal ages were a wonderful seed time in a world all gaunt with ruins. Horrors were there mingled with delicacies, and confusion with idyllic peace. It was here a poet's childhood passed amid the crash of war. There was an alchemist's old age, flickering away amid cobwebs and gibberish. Something jocund and mischievous peeped out even in the cloister. Gargoyles leered from the belfry, while ivy and holly grew about the cross. The Middle Ages were the true Renaissance. Their Christianity was the theme, the occasion. the excuse for their art and jollity, their curiosity and tenderness. It was far from being the source of those delightful inventions. The Crusades were not inspired by the Prince of Peace, to whose honor they were fancifully and passionately dedicated. So chivalry, Gothic architecture, and scholastic philosophy were profane expressions of a self-discovering genius in a people incidentally Christian. The barbarians had indeed been indoctrinated. They had been indoctrinated into an alien spiritual and historic medium, but they had not been made over or inwardly tamed. It had perhaps been rendered easier for them by contact with an existing or remembered civilization to mature their own genius, even in the act of confusing its expression through foreign accretions. They had been thereby stimulated to civilize themselves, and encouraged also to believe themselves civilized somewhat prematurely. The process of finding their own art and polity was bound on the whole to diverge more and more from its Latin model. It consisted now of imitation, now of revulsion and fanciful originality. Never was a race so much under the sway of fashions. Fashion is something barbarous, for it produces innovation without reason, and imitation without benefit. It marks very clearly that margin of irresponsible variation in manners and thoughts, which among a people artificially civilized may so easily be larger than the solid core. It is characteristic of Occidental society in medieval and modern times, because this society is led by people who, being educated in a foreign culture, remain barbarians at heart. Some educated persons, accordingly, are merely students and imbibers. They sit at the feet of a past which, not being really theirs, can produce no fruit in them but sentimentality. Others are merely Protestants. They are active in the moral sphere only by virtue of an inward rebellion against something greater and overshadowing, yet repulsive and alien. They are conscious truants from a foreign school of life. In the Protestant religion, it is necessary to distinguish inner inspiration from historical entanglements. Unfortunately, as the whole doctrinal form of this religion is irrelevant to its spirit and imposed from without, being due to the stepmotherly nurture they receive from the Church, we can reach a conception of its inner spirit only by studying its tendency and laws of change, or its incidental expression in literature and custom. Yet these indirect symptoms are so striking that even an outsider, if at all observant, need not fear to misinterpret them. Taken externally, Protestantism is, of course, a form of Christianity. It retains the Bible and a more or less copious selection of patristic doctrines, but in its spirit and inward inspiration it is something quite as independent of Judea as of Rome. It is simply the natural religion of the Teutons, raising its head above the flood of Roman and Judean influences. Its character may be indicated by saying that it is a religion of pure spontaneity, of emotional freedom, deeply respecting itself, but scarcely deciphering its purposes. It is the self-consciousness of a spirit in process of incubation, jealous of its potentialities, averse to definitions and finalities of any kind, because it can itself discern nothing fixed or final. It is adventurous and puzzled by the world, full of rudimentary virtues and clear fire, energetic, faithful, and rebellious to tradition. It accordingly mistakes vitality, both in itself and in the universe, for spiritual life. This underlying Teutonic religion, which we must call Protestantism for lack of a better name, is interior to Christianity and can survive it. To identify it with the gospel may have seemed possible so long as, in opposition to pagan Christianity, the Teutonic spirit could appeal to the gospel for support. The gospel has indeed nothing pagan about it, but it has also nothing Teutonic, and the momentary alliance of two such disparate forces must naturally cease with the removal of the common enemy which alone united them. The gospel is unworldly, disenchanted, ascetic. It treats ecclesiastical establishments with tolerant contempt, conforming to them with indifference. It regards prosperity as a danger, earthly ties as a burden, Sabbaths as a superstition. It revels in miracles. It is democratic and antinomian. It loves contemplation, poverty, and solitude. It meets sinners with sympathy and heartfelt forgiveness, but Pharisees and Puritans with biting scorn. In a word, it is a product of the Orient, where all things are old and equal, and a profound indifference to the business of earth breeds a silent dignity and a high sadness in the spirit. Protestantism is the exact opposite of all this. It is convinced of the importance of success and prosperity. It abominates what is disreputable. Contemplation seems to it idleness, solitude, selfishness, and poverty a sort of dishonorable punishment. It is constrained and punctilious in righteousness. It regards a married and industrial life as typically godly, and there is a sacredness to it, as of a vacant Sabbath, in the unoccupied higher spaces which such an existence leaves for the soul. It is sentimental, its ritual is meager and unctuous. It expects no miracles. It thinks optimism akin to piety, and regards profitable enterprise and practical ambition as a sort of moral vocation. Its benevolence is optimistic, and aims at raising men to a conventional well-being. It thus misses the inner appeal of Christian charity, which, being merely remedial in physical matters, begins by renunciation and looks to spiritual freedom and peace. Protestantism was therefore attached from the first to the Old Testament, in which Hebrew fervor appears in its worldly and pre-rational form. It is not democratic in the same sense as post-rational religions, which see in the soul an exile from some other sphere, wearing for the moment, perhaps, a beggar's disguise. It is democratic only in the sense of a popular origin and bending easily to popular forces. Swayed as it is by public opinion, it is necessarily conventional in its conception of duty and earnestly materialistic. For the meaning of the word vanity never crosses the vulgar heart. In fine, it is the religion of a race young, wistful, and adventurous, feeling its latent potentialities, vaguely assured of an earthly vocation, and possessing, like the barbarian and the healthy child, pure but unchastened energies. Thus the Protestant religion, the faith natural to barbarism, appears clothed, by force of historical accident, in the language of an adapted Christianity. As the Middle Ages advanced, the newborn human genius, which constituted their culture, grew daily more playful, curious, and ornate. It was naturally, in the countries formerly pagan, that this new paganism principally flourished. Religion began, in certain quarters, to be taken philosophically. Its relation to life began to be understood. That it was a poetic expression of need, hope, and ignorance. Here, prodigious vested interests and vested illusions of every sort made dangerous the path of sincerity. Genuine moral and religious impulses could not be easily dissociated from a system of thought and discipline with which for 1,000 years they have been intimately interwoven. Skepticism, instead of seeming what it naturally is, a moral force, a tendency to sincerity, economy, and fine adjustment of life and mind to reality. Skepticism seemed a temptation and a danger. This situation, which still prevails in a certain measure, strikingly shows into how artificial a posture Christianity has thrown the mind. If skepticism, under such circumstances, by chance penetrated among the clergy, it was not favorable to consistency of life, and it was the more certain to penetrate among them, and that their ranks, in a fat and unscrupulous age, would naturally be largely recruited from men without ideal ambitions. It became accordingly necessary to reform something, either this gay world to suit the Church's primitive austerity and asceticism, or the Church to suit the world's profane and general interests. The latter task was more or less consciously undertaken by the humanists who would have abated the clergy's wealth and irrational authority, advanced polite learning, and, while of course retaining Christianity, for why should an ancestral religion be changed, would have retained it as a form of paganism, as an ornament and poetic expression of human life. This movement had not been overwhelmed by the fanatical Reformation and the fanatical reaction against it, would doubtless have met with many a check from the Church's sincere zealots, but it could have overcome them, and, had it been allowed to fight reason's battle with reason's weapons, would ultimately have led to general enlightenment without dividing Christendom, kindling venomous religions and national passions, or vitiating philosophy. It was not humanism, however, that was destined to restrain and soften the Church, completing by critical reflection that paganization of Christianity which had taken place at the beginning instinctively and of necessity. There was now another force in the field, the virgin conscience and willfulness of the Teutonic races, sincerely attached to what they had assimilated in Christianity, and now awakened to the fact that they inwardly abhorred and rejected the rest. This situation, in so uncritical an age, could be interpreted as a return to primitive Christianity. And thus meeting the world, the soul without experience shows a fine courage proportionate to its own vigor. We may well imagine that lions and porpoises have a more masculine assurance that God is on their side than ever visits the breast of antelope or jellyfish. This assurance, when put to the test in adventurous living, becomes in a strong and high-bred creature a refusal to be defeated, a gallant determination to hold the last stitch and hope for the best in spite of appearances. It is a part of Protestantism to be austere, energetic, unwearied in some laborious task. The end and profit are not so much regarded as the mere habit of self-control, practical devotion, and steadiness. The only evils recognized seem so many challenges to action, so many conditions for some glorious, unthought of victory. Such a religion is indeed profoundly ignorant. It is the religion of inexperience. Yet it has, at its core, the very spirit of life. Its error is only to consider the will omnipotent and sacred, and not to distinguish the field of inevitable failure from that of possible success. Success, however, would never be possible without that fund of energy and latent resolve and determination which bring also faith in success. Animal optimism is a great renovator and disinfectant in the world. In the end, with the complete crumbling away of Christian dogma and tradition, absolute egotism appeared openly on the surface in the shape of German speculative philosophy. This form, which Protestantism assumed at a moment of high tension and reckless self-sufficiency, it will doubtless shed in turn and take on new expressions. But that declaration of independence on the part of the Teutonic spirit marks emphatically its exit from Christianity and the end of that series of transformations in which it took the Bible and patristic dogma for its materials. It now bids fair to apply itself instead to social life and natural science, and to attempt to feed its protean hunger directly from these more homely sources.